Terra is the name of the world Arknights takes place in. It's a planet, we know that much, but stuff related to space in Arknights is very weird when it comes to knowledge that's out on EN right now, and sometimes it's straight up contradicting. On one hand you will find stuff like the stars are not visible, on the other hand you will find people actively talk about the stars and the constellations they see, but what we can say for sure is the following: twin moons. We have two moons looking down on Terra. Other than that, who knows what we will learn with future events. The vast majority of Terra looks like this, the barren lands, very dry and arid, and whenever storms and rainstorms occur, they are accompanied by Originium falling down, and the day and night temperature swings are absolutely massive in the barrens too. By around midnight it's freezing. But you can find a very diverse amount of other biomes out there as well, like the Arctic North, close to the North Pole of the planet. During a blizzard it can reach temperatures of 43 degrees below zero Celsius, I think. Then there's the ocean or the sea. Research on the ocean is only conducted by very few people, and it's not a very popular field of research. Most people on land don't even know that the ocean exists. Something very interesting, there is no Originium in the ocean, in contrast to the land, where active Originium on the surface and in layers below ground, especially in deeper layers, causes a lot of problems, mostly in the form of catastrophes. The existence of Originium is responsible for the existence of catastrophes. There are areas that are more prone to catastrophes than others. It comes down to stuff like the density of Originium on the surface. Catastrophes take the form of various natural disasters, usually something like storms, floods or blizzards, but there's also earthquakes and sandstorms, sometimes even meteor showers. Catastrophes did not just appear with the industrialization of Originium or something, they have been around since forever, and they occur in rather frequent yet unpredictable intervals. They are considered to be the surest thing in the world. Prior to an upcoming catastrophe, so-called catastrophe clouds will start to form. You are going to see the clouds in the sky converge into one big cloud and then spread out and grow in size. You can tell them apart from regular rain clouds by measuring the moisture of air and wind. The air pressure will also change drastically during that period. As the catastrophe cloud forms, it gets darker and darker until it becomes pitch black. The wind stops and the catastrophe cloud is not moving. It feels like all of the stress out there is being composed into one single point. Originium levels in the atmosphere will increase very sharply in the presence of a catastrophe as well. You need to keep yourself covered, especially open wounds, as active Originium particles might enter your body. As time goes on, the catastrophe cloud becomes very clearly defined. You will hear thunder and it will feel very, very close. Arc lightnings that look almost alive will become visible. All of this will make you feel as if the heaven itself is threatening you, as if the sky is going to crash down. And then the catastrophe hits. What happens then obviously depends on what type of catastrophe it is. Usually it's some kind of natural disaster, but way stronger than the ones we know from our world. But there are a few things that all catastrophes have in common. After some time it will visibly weaken, and after it is over, active Originium will cover the areas affected by it. Catastrophes leave behind very Originium-dense zones. The Originium they leave behind is very potent and will often cluster into big clusters. Researchers assume that catastrophes might be partially responsible for the spread of Originium on the surface. Wild beasts are very sensitive to approaching catastrophes, and their behavior can be used as an indicator of an upcoming catastrophe. Wild beasts in general are very good at avoiding Originium pollution too. The wildlife on Terra is pretty good at dealing with all of the crazy things there. The perfect example for an Arknights beast definitely is the Originium slug. Those little fellas have absorbed Originium deep into the structure of their outer shell, because of which they have their name. Their insides, though, are absolutely unharmed or untouched by that Originium. There are no crystals in their quote-unquote actual body. Because of that, it is almost impossible to get infected from an Originium slug bite. But there's tons of other beasts on Terra, both wild and domesticated. Speaking of which, how does humanity deal with all of this? As mentioned earlier, catastrophes are very common and have always been very common. For the longest time, humanity had absolutely no way of protecting itself from them or dealing with them. That changed with the invention of the nomadic city. In order to avoid catastrophes, human civilization was moved into nomadic cities or mobile cities, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Gigantic cities built on gigantic vehicles that drive around in order to get away from catastrophes. Those can easily have tens of thousands of residents, and nowadays the vast majority of people live in nomadic cities. Those gigantic structures can only move around thanks to the insane amount of energy contained in Originium. Thanks to the industrialization of Originium and the invention of the nomadic city, there are way less deaths due to catastrophes than there used to be back in the day. Nomadic cities are made up of multiple individual city plates. Each city plate is made up of multiple layers for different purposes, like logistics, for example. On the edges of city plates you can find bridging points which get used to establish connections between individual plates. Each plate has its own sewer system too, in which you can usually encounter loads of Originium slugs, which canonically smell very bad. A mobile city of at least medium size should be self-sufficient. Some cities have agricultural plates on its outer parts, which specifically exist for the sake of producing crops and then transporting them inwards. Nowadays, some cities also have hydroponic plants, but those have only started to become a common thing within the last few decades. Furthermore, most of the arable land out there also gets claimed by cities and gets used for producing food. That depends on what part of the world you are visiting though, because remember, most of Terra is barren. Mobile cities have also brought the emergence of intercity networks and terms like online. Things that we would consider communication network technology is absolutely normal within mobile cities. Video sharing platforms exist, and things like sharing photos and videos has actually become pretty popular in recent times. Intercity networks work kind of differently from city to city, but you can adjust your smartphone accordingly so that it works in other cities. The network transmission range is limited though. Mobile cities come with a decent signal range, but outside of that you won't have signal. Outside of mobile cities, communication network technology is not that normal. The main reason for that is that Originium-rich zones interfere with communication technology. The only way to work around that would be to build a bunch of base stations in the wilderness, but those would be at a constant risk of catastrophes. Some nations use mobile base stations in order to deal with that, but that is rare. For most parts of Terra, you won't have any signal outside of mobile cities. Space is pretty limited inside of mobile cities. The inhabitants of mobile cities usually cremate their dead people because what little space you have inside of them is way too precious to be wasted on cemeteries. The system of nomadic cities has completely taken over, by the way. The vast majority of humanity lives in mobile cities. Non-nomadic settlements are rare. Nomadic villages are a thing. Most of the random small-scale settlements you come across in Arknights will be mobile. The only real exceptions to that rule are settlements that would be considered uncivilized by mainstream Terran society. All of this really begs the question of scale, doesn't it? Like, how big are they? Sadly, we have no real answer to this, but check out this. The nation of Victoria has around 40 million inhabitants and is confirmed to have 60 mobile cities. Now, does that mean that we can just take the population divided by city amount and take that result as the average city size? We absolutely don't have an answer to that question, I'm afraid. But before we get too nerdy, let's talk about the actual mobility of a mobile city. Mobile cities are absolutely not very fast. It usually takes a mobile city between 2 to 8 weeks to fully evacuate the area of a predicted catastrophe. In order to perform such an evacuation, a mobile city first has to figure out an evacuation route. Once that happens, they redirect their entire power from entertainment and public facilities and disconnect their individual city plates in order to move freely. You will usually not see a lot of mobile cities stay in areas with rather unstable weather. That's due to the fact that they are just not capable of maneuvering very fast. That's however not just due to technology, their political structures are also partially at fault for that. Because of the insane destructive potential of a catastrophe, your average mobile town or mobile city absolutely can't afford to get hit by a catastrophe. It will leave the area it is staying in once it receives enough warnings of an incoming catastrophe. Those warnings will usually come from the so-called catastrophe messengers. Catastrophe messengers are Terra's unsung heroes. They are a loose collective of people who roam the barren lands and watch out for changes in the weather in order to make predictions about where the next catastrophe will hit. All across Terra there exists this gigantic communication network that spans far beyond national borders. People become catastrophe messengers through this network, others just find employment through it. It is very efficient and it allows for communication across thousands of miles. Most catastrophe messengers work for a single city-state or a big corporation. That keeps them away from having to take risky jobs out there and guarantees them a nice salary. The entry barrier to do that is pretty high, though the assessment tests you have to go through are tough. Many catastrophe messengers don't do that and instead just hand out reports to people at transit stations. Catastrophe messengers, especially the independent ones, are tough and have their own ways of looking after themselves. Still though, catastrophe messengers are at a constant risk of contracting Oripathy while doing their job, and frankly, there aren't many catastrophe messengers who manage to avoid getting infected. Because of that, as well as the horrifying things they see out there and just the mental burden of being responsible for the well-being of an insane amount of people, many catastrophe messengers end up being traumatized and quit their job. The invention of the mobile city changed the way humanity thought and acted. It was about 200 years ago that the age of innovation started and Terra's modern era was kicked off. Before that point, there were no mobile cities. People lived completely at the mercy of catastrophes and were being scattered around by them constantly. The different cultures that had been broken up all across the land knew very little about one another. The concept of modern nations did not exist yet. There was no communication between all the different groups of people. The way of living, this kind of tribal society, completely dominated Terra for thousands of years. Back then, a nation was simply a gathering of people of similar lifestyles huddled together for safety in the face of catastrophes. National borders were simply whatever lay within their eyesight. Mobile cities changed that. When this so-called age of innovation came about and mobile cities gradually started to take over, we first saw the emergence of independent city-states. These would later group up and form bigger political entities, which would then become synonymous with the term nation. Nations as we find them in Arknights right now are the result of mobile cities. At the beginning of this new era, everyone focused on their own development first. Individual nations would only rarely come into contact with each other. However, as time progressed, we got more and more communication between them. And as they started to get into contact with each other, they started to get into conflicts between each other as well. The conflicts that arose between nations rapidly sped up the communication between them too. They began to enter trade agreements, establish trade companies in each other's territories. None of them really could keep themselves isolated anymore. And because of all of that, humanity obviously also found a way to weaponize the concept of a mobile city. Siege weapons were developed strong enough to damage mobile cities. Fortress cities, which were built for the sole purpose of warfare, started to exist. But even regular cities were equipped for warfare and used accordingly. The concept of high-speed battleships came to be. Those are essentially mobile city plates which were equipped to traverse the barren lands as land ships with a very high speed and armaments strong enough to annihilate entire mobile city plates. Something highly important to note when talking about nations, by the way, if you look for an Arknights world map, you are very likely to come across something like this. These colored polygons represent individual nations. They do not represent land masses. What you see here does not visualize coastlines and bodies of water. It just visualizes the parts of Terra which are under the control of individual nations. These parts are not water, it's just that a large chunk of Terra is not under the control of any of the existing nations. And with these 4 videos, you know pretty much everything important about the world of Arknights. Now, let's talk about the people who inhabit said world. After all, we keep using the word humanity. Next episode, races. Click on the left for a quick summary of Arknights Lore, click on the right for all Arknights Lore videos, click on the center for the second channel with way more Arknights content, and big shout out to Carousel Alpha, Chris, Darth Eldershield, Demoboy125, Elite117, Evan Heckler, Jimshot First, Kivinator, Longo Neo Salvesa, and Phoenix. Thanks for your support, guys. Cheers.